Everybody's process is different, but
Hmm.
that was super key for me in terms of really trying to get it right.
So let's talk about the creative process and
Okay.
what was your strategy going into it. Yeah, where did you go? Just walk us through the actual creation of your, especially your last talk, the talk that you just did, the power of everyday equity.
Okay. The two experiences were very different. Okay. So the first talk was about grief, and I was living that, and it kind of poured out of me. The second talk is more related. It definitely is related to my life, but it's also related to my work. So I'm an equity strategist, speaker, and consultant. And so there's so much going on in the world. And I was like, I really want to have this idea that would make this idea of equity more palatable, because for a lot of people it can be polarizing and political and all of that. And I thought, my simple idea is, if we do something every single day that helps to build community, if we do something every single day where we see people as our neighbors and we do what's necessary to make sure we all have what we need to thrive, we're going to get closer to equity. We're going to get closer to equity than we are if we're infighting and should we use the word equity or not, and what is this. And so that was really kind of where that big idea was birthed from. Like, I took it back to my roots in Appalachia. I'm from Eastern Kentucky. And so my creative process was, let me go back to my community. I grew up in a small town. I grew up in a place where we really saw each other as neighbors. I grew up in a place where we didn't use words like who was privileged and who wasn't, although that's implicit in community. But we grew up thinking, okay, you need to borrow some sugar, let me get it to you, right? I grew up in a place where we were all trying to do what was necessary to make it and to do well. And so when I started thinking about this idea of everyday equity, for me to start writing, I had to put myself back in my small hometown. So when somebody, when folks go back to see that talk, they'll hear me talking about my experience as a high school student, my experience going away to college, my experience when I went abroad for a 3-week stint, because I was really putting myself back in my own story, a story that I don't want to be detached from, a story that I feel very, very connected to, even though I haven't lived in my hometown for 30 years. So the writing process for me was to put myself back in that place, was to really think about what it is that I wanted to put out there, what this big idea was, and really, really to kind of harness it in this talk. Now, this is the other thing that I did. This is unique to me. Maybe not unique to me, but this is another thing that I did. I really feel like this idea of equity is not a people idea. I think it's a God idea. It's something that God wants. So actually, our mutual friend Daryl encouraged me, because I'm also a minister in terms of my church existence. He encouraged me to write a sermon called God's Heart for Equity.
That
Now, again,
Daryl, that Daryl Stinson, man.
listen, he
Woo.
he's such a great coach, and he speaks especially to people who are people of faith. He speaks to all people, but for me as a person of faith, like, he knows how to tap in and to help me tap in. And the reason that was so foundational and revelational for me is because you want to be able to posit faith in a way that isn't off-putting. You want to be able to put forth great principles in the earth that aren't theologically specific, right? Especially on a TEDx stage. But I knew in my heart of hearts that this wasn't a Matisa message, that this is a God message. And so he was like, okay, what is God's heart for equity? So I spent time writing a sermon and delivering a sermon with passion that I felt like was God's heart. Then what I did from there was I translated those principles into my talk, and I couched them within my personal story.